This is Christopher Jon Bjerknes. It is September 8th, 2023. I would like to first switch my glasses and then thank my contributors, especially for the Bitcoin. That was wonderfully helpful. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, John Geraitis. You really saved me. You came through for me, and I'm tremendously grateful. Thank you to everyone who contributed on PayPal as well and elsewhere. I am very fortunate and honored today to have as my guest Joseph Atwill, the famous author of Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. We have covered many of the same subjects from a very different perspective. We agree about a lot. There's a lot that we view differently, and I think it will be very productive to go over our areas of agreement and those areas where we disagree, so that my audience can view it from both perspectives, first person. So please welcome Mr. Joseph Atwill. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Christopher.
Let me give my understanding of what your primary thesis is. And that is that the character, Jesus Christ, is a fictional character, but it is based on the Emperor Titus and the events and the figures that Josephus incorporated into his history. The wars of the Jews then became the life and the prophetic statements and predictions of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And you correlate many New Testament figures and New Testament events to the figures and events which are prominent in the wars of the Jews. And you, whenever there are discrepancies in the names, in the nomenclature, somewhat in the dates, although you try to match the dates up exactly, you say that this is done as a form of encryption to prevent people from realizing that the typology of what is happening is presented in the form of satire. And it was done in such a way and coded in such a way that only those in the know, meaning primarily the families of the Flavian emperors, would be aware of what was actually being depicted and the joke that was being played upon the Judeans by the Romans, who wanted to bring to an end the rebellious Sicarii and the messianic ambitions of the Judeans to become rulers of the world. And Josephus openly and publicly predicted that Vespasian would become the Messiah, meaning the Messiah of the world and the Messiah that was predicted in Judaism to represent the God of Israel. Do I have it right?
No, I would characterize it as follows. The Synoptic Gospels are created as prefiguration typology, which is a form of fiction. It's religious fiction. The system that they follow is given to the reader in the first pages of Matthew. You get the typology, prefiguration typology that is created between Jesus Christ and Moses. And if you're familiar with that, I won't bother doing it. I imagine many people are, but it's just that the whole pre-ministry of Jesus, his young years, were developed out of the Old Testament, specifically the Exodus stories. Okay, so you have there, Matthew uses names, locations, and concepts from the Old Testament stories, and he arranges them into the story of Jesus in the same sequence. And this is the absolute critical oversight of New Testament scholarship, is they did not understand that the sequence of events in the adult ministry of Jesus has a very, very important meaning. In fact, it is the most important element in the entire story. So in Matthew, you have the pre-ministry of Jesus is prefiguring. In other words, what the author is doing, he's saying that all of these events from the Old Testament are linked to or parallel to events in Jesus's life. Now, this isn't verbatimism.
But this
Prefiguration
was
typology.
anticipated in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 18, that the Messiah would be a prophet whose life would be like that of Moses.
Yeah, yeah.
So this fits
So
in with Judaism and not
when they say
Romanism.
like Moses, what they're referring to is that there is a divine hand, that God basically organizes these events so that someone who is reading about them later on can see that there is a divinity that is overseeing the life of Jesus. This is the point of the prefiguration typology that is in the first pages of Matthew, and this really isn't controversial, Christopher. It's not, oddly
No, this
enough,
has been known for a very long time.
widely known, but I
It's
mean,
very
Goulder,
similar to the way that it prefigured by the character Joseph.
Goulder knew about this and wrote about this 100 years ago almost. And so this is well known to New Testament scholarship, and it's not in any way controversial. And it's pretty much self-evident once you kind of understand the system. What I show is that the exact same system is continued. It doesn't stop with the events in the wilderness, where Jesus is mimicking the events in the wilderness that Moses experienced, but rather it simply goes on, and another work is now
If I may
being.
interrupt, but it's
Sure.
completely different in terms of its antinomianism. Jesus was an undoer of the law, and Moses was the giver of the law.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into these details later, but the point is, just in terms of the literary structure, what you're looking at is prefiguration typology, linking Jesus backwards to Moses, and then Jesus's life is created as prefiguration typology, and it uses the exact same system that is found in Matthew. It uses names, location, concepts occurring in the same sequence. Now, again, it's not verbatimism. Now, some of the events are exactly verbatim, like encircling Jerusalem with a wall, or the destruction of the temple, or the abomination of desolation, or a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. These things are basically the same thing. There isn't any concept distinction between them. They're just known by historians and by New Testament scholars as being the exact that the event in the story of Jesus was taken from, is relating to the thing in the history of Josephus. But what I do is I show, look, there's dozens and dozens of events which are occurring in the same sequence, many of which have been recognized by scholars. But what they didn't understand is, one, they didn't understand the system of prefiguration typology that is used in the Gospels. And two, they didn't bother to look at the whole sequence of the events of Jesus to see how the event that they would be characterizing as a parallel was relating to other things that could be seen as parallel. Because as I pointed out, that if you just take the events that are the same thing, like the encircling Jerusalem with a wall, and the events which other scholars have done analysis of as seemingly dependent upon one another, or having some bizarre parallelism that seems to need an explanation. If you just take that, you have an overwhelming case for the fact that the ministry of Jesus is dependent upon, it was generated from the history of Josephus. So that's that's kind of an overview of the Caesar's Messiah um, analysis, is that it just demonstrates that the adult ministry of Jesus is prefiguration typology, and what it is prefiguring, what it looks to, is the Son of Man that Jesus is envisioning. Jesus says the Son of Man will come. He gives a date when he will show up, and he talks about the destruction that will occur with his visitation. And the prefiguration typology is just there to show that this identity, that this individual has a clear identity, that the Son of Man that Jesus is envisioning is in fact the Flavian Caesar. So that's the Caesar's Messiah, analysis, and it's interesting in that it's built up of basically the text. I don't really manipulate the text. I do in the real complicated parallels. I will do analysis, but even if you excluded them, the case would still be overwhelming that if you once you just align the text side by side, you can see that Jesus was basically created as prefiguration typologic figure to foresee the Flavian Caesar. Now,
If
why
I
this?
may,
Of course, go ahead.
I have several questions about that.
Sure.
The term Son of Man is used in different ways in Judaism, in different contexts, and by different characters. It can represent Adam, it can represent prophets, it can represent just every person being a son of man. Jesus was also referred to as Son of God.
Sure.
On what basis do you identify that term as prefiguring and correlating to Titus? And I assume you are referring to Titus when he was involved in the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, I mean, it is a title that can be applied as well. First of all, it's very plastic, just as you mentioned. But the characterization of the Son of Man in the Gospels is self-evident. I mean, he is coming with the specific destruction. If you go, I mean, I could read the passage where you actually have the destruction of the temple. The character is named the Son of Man as basically the powerful individual whose visitation is about to occur. And then he gives the date that he will show up, which will be, in 40 years, basically, when the destruction of the temple and the Jewish worker. So
So he is an agent of the Father of Jesus, and he is an agent of divine punishment. He is an agent who will fulfill prophecy, the prophecies of Deuteronomy, the prophecies of Isaiah, Zechariah, Malachi, and you list most specifically the prophecies of Daniel, and he will follow the chronology of Daniel, and you assert that Josephus has manipulated the actual factual dates in such a manner as to make it appear that those prophecies had been fulfilled and that this Son of Man was a divine agent of punishment. And I'm wondering...
Yeah, just let me so the reader or listener can understand that. This is from taken in, it's in Josephus. He describes when the abomination of desolation occurs. Okay, he gives a specific date for the end of the daily sacrifice. And if you're reading the Whiston version, you can see that this was
the Whiston version of Josephus.
Yeah, the Whiston version of Josephus. You can see that, it's about 3.5 years from the start of the war. Daniel prophesies that this event would occur at the midpoint of a week being 7 years. The war lasts 7 years. The abomination of desolation occurs at the midpoint. And then 3.5 years later, you have the end of the war with the fall of Masada. So this is clearly artificial, I would say. I mean, it's,
Masada never happened, as you point out.
Well, I mean, the date given for Masada is, Passover 73. That would be.
But also the event of the self-sacrifice of the people and the mass self-slaughter to make it appear as if it were, in a sense, divine punishment, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, my position here. I think that this we're dealing with fiction, not with.
I agree.
And so what Josephus is doing there is creating a literary cartoon or fantasy built up out of the prophecies that this author is aware of.
And it's necessary to do in order to create the parallel, in your view, between the 40 years that Moses was in the wilderness and the 40 years between when Jesus was crucified and Masada
really
took place.
Critical because, again, this is something where New Testament scholarship, I mean, I'm sorry to say, it just is not alert here. The Passover lamb, the beginning of the Christian religion is, can be determined to be Passover 33. They're obviously mirroring with the typology of the Passover lamb in the gospel, the Passover lamb in the original story, right? I mean, this is self-evident. So the date of the 40 years of wandering, which would have to be in place if you're going to continue the mirror of the first first Passover lamb, would be 40 years from that date, which would be Passover 73, which is the date that Josephus gives for the fall of Masada. So that 40-year cycle is a mirror of the first Passover and the 40 years of wandering, and moreover, the date is exactly the same for the conclusion of Daniel's prophecy. The 3.5 years is inserted at exactly the right point, so that the end of the week would be the 73 Passover.
But Josephus himself never, and the testimonium itself is open to debate whether it's authentic or not. I hold that it's not, you hold that it is. But Josephus himself never portrays Jesus Christ as being crucified on the Passover precisely 40 years before Masada, and the New Testament never speaks of Masada.
It's the Prefiguration Typology is using two texts to create this information.
Okay, I think it's important to point that out, that this has to be deduced from the utilization of two separate texts, and that individually, neither text, you cannot derive it individually from either text individually, taken individually.
Correct. Yeah, you have to. I mean, all prefiguration typology is, one story is dependent on the other.
Some other questions I have in regards to that.
Yeah.
Do you believe that Jesus, when he refers to his Father, is speaking of the Tetragrammaton, or is speaking of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, as many of the Gnostic cults, the Ophites, the Nazarenes, etc., portrayed it, and they portrayed the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, as an evil deity of the demiurge?
I would say that the question is sort of artificial, in that if you just look at my analysis, what you have when in Jesus speaking to the Father are typological relationships to basically the relationship between Titus and his father. If you go to the Arch of Titus,
Vespasian.
I mean, so in other words, what I'm saying is that the people who are producing the literature, who are creating the character Jesus Christ, are consciously and only producing prefiguration typology. Now, they obviously have a thought world from which their fantasy is emerging, and as a lot of people who do scholarship in this point out, there are all these other kind of prophecies and religious perspectives that enter into what they produced. But the primary purpose of all of the literature is just the vanity of the Flavian Caesars. They wanted to create a legacy for themselves as basically a kind of messianic character who came and was actually foreseen by the Jewish religion. The same position.
Isn't that sacrilegious? And one of the difficulties I have with your book is, why would a Roman emperor who perceived of himself as a god want to be portrayed in a satire as a comical figure who is the suffering Messiah of Isaiah 53, who is scourged, who is a a defiled figure?
Well, first of all, I would say that as far as understanding the psychology of Caesars, I would question to what extent we have understanding of that. It's they seem to be
Well, just in terms of human nature. Why
yeah,
would
but
someone want to be satirically and comically parodied by a
well,
subject figure
just
of
for
the suffering Messiah? Because it plays such an important role in Judaism that this Messiah suffer.
you've already given the answer though. You've already pointed out that Josephus actually made the declaration that the Jewish prophecies foresaw Vespasian's government. And this, of course, is the official Flavian position because Josephus wrote this purportedly while he was in the imperial court of the Flavians. So you're not going to get anything from him that is, not seen by them in a good light. In fact, in the book, in Wars of the Jews, Josephus states that Titus was so excited and happy by the work that he affixed his own name to it.
But that's War of the Jews. That's not the New Testament.
Right, but this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the statement by Josephus, which is reflection of the Flavian understanding of their theological place in the world, which has Josephus's flat-out declaration.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
That the Flavians were the ones who these prophecies envisioned.
Let me
So
give you
that
my vision
when you
of
have
what
the
that
gospel,
represents in terms
when
of
you have the
Judaism.
when you have the Gospels creating prophecies, which are basically then going to be fulfilled by the Son of Man when he shows up.
But they created them after the events had occurred,
Exactly.
so they were simply
Yeah.
formulating it in such a manner that it appeared that Jesus was a divine figure who had prophecy and foreknowledge, that he was a righteous tzaddik who had seen the book of life.
And he was being guided by this divine hand. I mean,
Yes.
the journey that he's making is the same journey that Titus is making. You're getting events occurring at the same locations. And so the whole structure of the Gospels is the literary structures being set up so that the vanity of the Caesar can be assuaged. Okay, so
Let me
really
give you an alternative view of the same set of facts.
Yeah.
In Judaism, and this is foreshadowed in Zechariah and in Isaiah, there are two different types of messiahs. There is a Messiah, son of Joseph, who is the suffering Messiah, who often appears as a Gentile, as in the case of Cyrus in Isaiah 45:1, who was the anointed Messiah. And that Messiah, as a Gentile, often performs and plays the roles that Satan performs and plays as the instrument, the agency of divine punishment. And he operates as Samael among the Gentiles as a subversive force. And he becomes their leader and is directed by the Messiah, son of David, who is the other Messiah, who is the actual king who is to rule in Jerusalem after Messiah, son of Joseph, does his work, enables the Gentiles to build a worldwide empire in which they get rid of all pagan religion and establish the preconditions for Messiah, son of David, to then take over and rule the world from that throne. And in this process, the Messiah, son of Joseph, is slain and gives up his soul, which is then inherited into the vessel of Messiah, son of David. And he performs this useful role often as a substitute fool king, as in the case of Jesus Christ and Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas represents Messiah, son of David. Jesus Christ represents Messiah, son of Joseph. Messiah, son of Joseph, is slain in order to spare the life of Messiah, son of David. And this, there is a typological foreshadowing of this in 1 Samuel, where you have the King Saul's two children, Jonathan, who becomes John, the disciple that Jesus loved, and his sister, Michal. And Saul fears and was told that David would replace him as king. So he sends messengers to come and kill David. David places an idol in his bed with goat's hair on it. That goat's hair represents the scapegoat. So this idol then becomes the substitute fool king who is killed in order to spare the life of Messiah, son of David. And this is retold in the story of the empty tomb, where you have the same characters. You have Mary playing the role of Michal, and you have John reappearing as John the Evangelist, the son of Saul, Jonathan, who very much loved David. In both instances, many scholars believe that there was a homosexual relationship between David and Jonathan, and between Jesus Christ and the beloved John the Evangelist. That has also been interpreted to mean that Lazarus was the actual disciple whom Jesus loved. So we have this roles of these two separate messiahs. So when Josephus was declaring that Vespasian would come into power, he was announcing Messiah, son of Joseph, not Messiah, son of David. And that was his role as the prophet Elijah, which was replicated by John the Baptist. John the Baptist also announced Messiah, son of Joseph. Jesus was the son of Joseph. And I think it's telling that Josephus's very name was Joseph. The real Messiah, son of David, was the family of Philo Judaeus and Alexander Lysimachus. I always have trouble with that. Lysimachus. And what happened was that the Judeans had been conquered by the Romans, and they felt obliged, of course, to defeat the Romans. They attempted to defeat them militarily and failed, but they always maintained tremendous power through their wealth and manipulation of gold. Cicero recorded as early as 62 BC this is recorded in Pro Flaccus, that Flaccus had complained that the Judeans were hoarding the gold of the empire and shipping it to Jerusalem. And when Flaccus said this in court, he had to whisper and had to separate the judges because of the tremendous power that the Judeans exercised, and he feared for his life. Caligula worked against that power and tried to treat the Judeans with no special privileges or regard for their specific religion. And this brought him into conflict with Philo, who was one of the most prominent figures in Alexandria, Egypt. Caligula had begun placing statues of himself as if God into the synagogues, which was something that the Jews could not tolerate based on their religion. So Philo resented that, and then it really was brought to a head when Caligula Gaius set about to place a statue of himself as the god Jupiter in the temple. And Philo made a trip to Rome and advocated against that and asked them to stop. And when Caligula refused, he threatened Caligula's life and said that the God of Israel would assassinate Caligula. Lysimachus, his brother, was placed in prison. Lysimachus was the wealthiest man in the world. He was connected to the royal family through Caligula's uncle Claudius, whose mother Antonia, as you mentioned in your book, was involved financially with Lysimachus. Lysimachus had also made massive loans to Agrippa I. These characters, Philo, Lysimachus, and Agrippa I, arranged the assassination of Caligula through the Praetorian Guard, and they assassinated him.
Where is that? Do you have a citation for that?
The citation is,
For
I researched all this 20 years ago, and I
I'm
put it
very
all in
interested
my
in
book.
what I'm interested in is a citation that the Alexander family assassinated Caligula, because I
That
don't
can be
know.
drawn from it is a logical
Okay, so there's not a
deduction
citation.
based upon the facts that it was.
Okay, I got it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought there might be a citation. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I'll try to find one for you. I think that's important. And I also think it's important to make clear that the reason I derive that conclusion is that it was only Philo who directly threatened the life of the emperor, that it was the Judeans who had the motive to do it at that exact time because there was a ship bearing the statue of Caligula headed for the temple. And because it
It's
was
logical.
known, I do have citations for Agrippa.
Conjecture is logical. I will give you that. I just didn't know there was. I was unaware. I'm pretty familiar with the history of this era, and I've never seen that citation. But you can conjecture it, from other facts. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay, so we now have Claudius as emperor, who is connected to this family, and I believe that either Philo, Eudaeus, or Lysimachus, who was the wealthiest man in the world, represented the character of Messiah, son of David, not Messiah, son of Joseph. So they needed this Messiah, son of Joseph, in order to subvert the empire in the same way that Joseph had subverted the Egyptian empire, which is why it is referred to as the Messiah, son of Joseph. Daniel played the same role with Nebuchadnezzar. Shabbatai Tzevi played the same role with the Caliphate and with the Ottoman Empire. So this is a recurring thing that happens, and they have records of who it is they assert is Messiah, son of Joseph, and who is Messiah, son of David. Jesus Christ is well recognized as representing the figure of the Messiah, son of Joseph. So his role was to infiltrate the Roman Empire and subvert it. And I believe that is why the Christian religion appeals to poverty, giving up childbirth, surrendering to authority, and basically becomes a suicide cult as it did in the Cathars. And that it was only Orthodox Christianity who declared that the original beliefs of the early Christians, as Walter Bauer pointed out, were these Gnostic beliefs in these self-defeating things. And the Kabbalists have affirmed the fact that they perceive Jesus as this Messiah, son of Joseph. And they go further and point out that Adam and Eve were not the parents of Cain. Instead, it was the serpent from the Garden of Eden who was an incubus and a succubus who impregnated Eve in the garden to produce the child Cain. And we have a repetition of that in the story of the virgin birth of Jesus, where the incubus and succubus of Samael and Lilith impregnate Mary. So Mary is symbolic of Eve in that sense. And the Kabbalists say that Jesus is the reincarnated soul of Cain that was passed through Esau. Esau was a reincarnation of Cain. Jesus is a reincarnation of Cain. So the purpose of this figure, Messiah, son of Joseph, is to serve the role of Satan. And one of the very essential roles of Satan in Judaism is to serve as the tempter, the accuser, the prosecutor, and the divine punisher. So what it would have meant to Josephus when he was acting as Elijah, the prophet, to say that Vespasian was to become the Messiah was that he would become the Messiah, son of Joseph, and impose divine punishment on the wicked generation of the Jews of Josephus's era. But he would also be an agent of the Messiah, son of David, in the form of Tiberius Julius Alexander, or in the form of Lysimachus. And he would serve him and fulfill ultimately what was to become the destruction of the Roman Empire through Christianity. And I think that we agree on many, many facts, but I think that's where our two theories diverge. And it would be so wonderful if we could go over the very insightful things that you bring up in your book in regard to the demoniac. I think we covered the empty tomb in my view of it. You can give your view of it and take as much time as you want. You've been tremendously patient listening to me, and I'm very grateful to you.
Well, I mean, I have my analysis of the empty tomb is in the book. It's fairly complicated. I think I would just suggest people who are interested in it just buy the book and give feedback to me if they have any questions. You know, first of all, just to comment on your analysis, you know, it seems very complex to me, and I haven't had a chance ever to read it, so I don't have intimate understanding of it. Certainly, I have no way of negating it. I can't even imagine how one could falsify it just in general, because it's complicated and there are logical conjectures and things within it. So as far as falsifying it, I don't know. I will support it in the following way, though. I will point out that the people who created the literature in the Gospels were certainly aware of, you know, literary depths and of very, very subtle meanings that they were creating, you know, basically that is not on the surface narration. That, I mean, just typology in and of itself creates meaning that is not on the surface. You can be reading both texts and come to a completely clear understanding of what their meaning is, but then when you see them, one is typologically related to another, then suddenly, you know, the meaning that the authors are trying to generate just changes completely. So you need to have a sort of an understanding of the actual kind of literary construction technique and purpose that the authors are doing. But they will put in depth. They are very much capable of the kind of depth and of deep symbolism, hidden symbolism, symbolism relating to things within the Old Testament, and they can be using that symbolism to make political comments, to make, you know, this is absolutely possible. I put out some of that in the book. I don't go into much of it because, as I'm sure you're aware, when you put out things this complicated, it is, you know, it's hard to get New Testament scholarship to really pay attention to it, and it's easy for them to just dismiss it, you know, just on the grounds that, well, it's, you know, it just seems hard to understand. And that's why when I put out Caesar's Messiah, you'll know that, you know, I'm sure you've read the Flavian signature chapter. This is just the most straightforward and simple way of representing kind of the prefiguration nature of the material. There's a lot more depth, things that I'm sure you'd find a lot more interesting, but I'm not going into those things because I had enough on my plate just defending this vision that I had, this understanding, because it was so new to New Testament scholarship. But let me tell you something. I would much rather, it'd be more fun for me to spend time with the kind of depth and the symbolism that you're involved with. These are the things that would be interesting to me as a literary, you know, sort of analysis. But I didn't really get into that at all in the book. I just wanted to bring out this kind of straightforward understanding of the prefiguration typology. And I used, wherever I could, Christopher, I used parallels that other scholars had seen. So the more complex ones I didn't put in the book. The things that are of the depth that you're talking about, I didn't use those. I tried to use just the things that are actually historically the same, and parallels that are so overt that other scholars had written about them. And in doing that, I just set up basically the platform, right? Other scholars, you know, can now go forward and add in the levels of depth and the actual deep meaning that the Gospels portray. And like I said, that would be way more interesting to me than, particularly at this point in my career, than the analysis in Caesar's Messiah. But I did it in that form. I'm sure you can understand why I did it in that form, because I wasn't really trying to talk to people who were involved in the depth that you're mentioning and going into with your analysis. I was just trying to give a straightforward understanding to a common person that, look, the story of Jesus is not history. He is not a historical character. He's a typological character. Here, as you can show the dependency between the Gospels and Josephus. Now, having set up the platform, I hope it's actually useful to people who want to go into the real depth that the authors were engaged in. I hope that you know, the analysis I do can be useful for people like yourself that you know, will go into this material. And I will read your book. I just haven't really had a chance because you know, I've been involved in the Shakespearean world now for
Mhm.
quite some time with my book on Shakespeare, and it's almost, believe me, the Shakespearean scholars are even worse than the New Testament scholars. And I also want to say that I've experienced so much discrimination and ad hominem just because I was not in the club of New Testament scholarship. I can imagine, and my analysis is really see spot run, you know. I can imagine how difficult it is for someone like you who's actually trying to get into the depths of what is going on
I
in the
think
field.
Richard Carrier treated you abominably, and I
That,
think his
which,
ad hominem tax
yeah,
belittle him and no one else. I don't think
you
he.
know, Chris, I'll just say he was like actually just very typical. The New Testament scholars, you
That's why
know,
it got nowhere for 2,000 years, is because
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah,
2,000 years they behave exactly the way they're
yeah,
behaving today. They have a priest class that has their dogma, and they refuse to tolerate any deviation from their dogma, and they are didactic and
exactly right.
pedantic. And
And not to interrupt, but Christopher, when people like you and I bring out our works, what do we expect? You
yeah,
know, we wouldn't need to bring out our books if there was a vibrant and open-minded scholarship world of studying the New Testament. If it wasn't just controlled by dogmatists and little tiny fiefdoms and people wanting to attack anyone that is, you know, has an imagination. I mean, that's just the world that exists. So when you enter the world with new ideas, the first thing you can expect is, um, you know, hatred and ad hominem. It's just the nature of academia. I really, you know, it's not just, um, and it isn't just New Testament scholarship. Believe me, uh, someday we can have some fun, and I can go through some of the emails I get from Shakespearean scholars. You know, I mean, so
so,
anyway,
what is your perspective on Shakespeare? Do you think Shakespeare
well,
wrote it, or Bacon, or
no,
someone
no,
else?
no. It's the Shakespearean material is just in a nutshell. It's a Jewish literature genre that is mocking the true nature of the Christian literature. So it reverses it very often, like in Titus Andronicus. You know, you have the Flavians mentioned,
Merchant
and
of
then
Venice and Shylock and
well, that
Guildenstern and Rosencrantz?
every play, unfortunately, with the Shakespearean stuff, it's fairly complicated. Every play needs a little bit of manipulation and explanation. But you know, they are all created basically to mock and reverse the uh, what what this group felt was the psychological and irreverent perspective of the people who wrote the Gospels, particularly the Flavians. So they will set up, you know, characters like Titus Andronicus as typological send up of Titus Flavius, and then mock him. He has a Last Supper. He has the, you know, the crucifixion scene is there, and but all of it leads to catastrophe for the Gentiles. In other words, whereas in the gospel story you have the, you know, the Jews are unwittingly eating human flesh. Well, here they reverse it, and the Gentiles do it. And so this is just the nature of the Shakespearean literature. It's just I mean, even the name of the individual, Will Shakespeare, is it's a pun, will Shakespeare. It's a martial declaration, that this group made against the idea that they were forced into being Christians. In Britain in this time, Jews weren't permitted; you had to convert. But nevertheless, they were practicing Jews. They just had to do it in secret. So this literature comes out of that kind of paranoid and angry world that these people lived in.
When you
And
get it
so
all
Will,
together, please come back and
yeah,
we'll
well,
go into
yeah,
it.
I'm happy to talk about that. But it's like the thing is, honestly, I would love to find. I haven't read your book, and I wish I had. I just don't have enough hours in the day, but I'm going to. But I love just kind of the imagination and the use of logic to make sense out of it that you're exhibiting with the analysis that you presented.
Thank you
I would
very much.
love to find a way to support it and to get what it certainly deserves: honest and legitimate attention from New Testament scholarship. So how do we achieve that? How do we actually get it to be reviewed by people who interact with you and give you who will go to the length needed to understand what you're saying? You see what I mean?
I'm
It's like,
trying. I don't know.
I know, and
Derek Lambert could certainly
especially for the
facilitate that if he
effort. And
only would.
if I can help, let me know, because this is the kind of, I mean, look, we're sitting here 2,000 years after the fact, and there's been almost zero progress made in the literature. It's really an embarrassment to humanity that this thing is still sitting there causing trouble. When someone
Oh
like you
yeah,
comes along and
and it
decodes it,
forecasts the destruction of humanity. It's a threat
well,
to every person. It's done terrible harm to Jews. It's done terrible harm to Gentiles, and it was
absolutely,
engineered for that purpose.
exactly right. Couldn't agree more. So anyway, this is why I think well, let me back up. I have experienced discrimination at that level where I'm seen, my material is seen as a threat to larger forces. And so, to become public, to do lectures and things is actually unpleasant, personally for me to do. So, um, it's the world we live in, and we are trying. People like you and myself are trying to create a more open mind in the public, first of all, so they can spend some time just looking at the different ways of understanding the literature. I mean, the Christians believe it as history, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Things that can be dismissed on their face as
yeah,
patently
yeah, yeah.
absurd and as self-contradictory, they accept
Well, that's right,
blindly.
and like you pointed out very well, that the religion is particularly dangerous now. I mean, I think the religion is very useful to the oligarch class, and I don't trust the oligarchs at this point because they have too much technology. And I
No,
think for democracy to survive, the public, the common person, needs to develop a more evolved skill of democracy, so that we don't give these people our trust, so that we're more skeptical. And see, this is one of the things I really want to support about your work, is that to have the open mind to even begin to understand what you're trying to say, you have to have gotten rid of the trust of the work as history and have the open mind of skepticism. I'm going to look at this literature trying to understand its deep meaning, its complicated meaning, without prejudice of what I've been told and what the forces of domination, of our culture are pushing me toward. I'm going to be a more, skeptical scholar and have my own mind. So anyway,
well, I think if our dialogue, somebody can help to make it viral, they'll be forced to. If we
sure.
can develop a popular movement, there will have to be a response because their interests are at stake and they'll feel a need to respond. And if they don't respond responsibly, then we got them.
Well, all I can say is I just hope you have a lot of energy, and that the forces of the world are aligned so that you have enough time to manifest. I mean, this is you know let's hope for the future, that it's better and that we can get the information out. I've been, frankly, particularly given the initial reaction, I've been pleased, with the overall response to the book. It's been a bestseller.
Hmm.
It's continuing to sell well. People are sort of interested in it. The reaction against it becomes stronger all the time. People hate me specifically. You've seen, I'm sure, all the internet, hatred of me as an individual. There's hatred of me now. The Shakespearean business. I'm destroying Western civilization by conjecturing that the literature was written by a Jewish woman. Um,
It was a
and then
woman?
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think actually I think it's a committee. I don't think one person, but there certainly was this one individual who was sort of the lead writer, Amelia Bassano.
Well, that would fit in with the theory that a pseudonym had to be used because a woman
Yeah,
wouldn't be taken seriously as a playwright. They
right.
weren't even taken seriously as actors.
That's right. And it's kind of sort of like anyway. I mean, I don't want to talk about that book too much. I know you've got other things you're interested here in terms of you talking about in your own work, but it's again, it's just, if you have an open mind, you really can see through the whole Shakespearean authorship question, at least to the extent of the guy from Avon that they characterize as the author is impossible. He doesn't have the thought world. He doesn't have, any of the backgrounds needed to produce all these arcane little elements of information that the author had. There really was only a small group of people that had all of the prerequisites, and so he's not in that class. He can't speak the languages. He doesn't know what a Lombardy mile would be. Things like the Italian slang words and things. So anyway,
Does it correlate in any sense to the Wycliffe translation and the later King James translation and the
all of I'll tell you
Protestant movement?
this would be a great discussion. I don't want to get into it right now, particularly since you haven't read the book. But if you read Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, it kind of leaves off just with that question, and it shows how prescient you are, Christopher, that you came right to the conclusion of the book. Maybe you don't even need to read it, but yeah, the King James Bible is very much related. I show some of the Shakespearean influence in the translation of the King James Bible, and now I can explain why it's in there. I put that in Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. You might find it interesting. I don't know,
What
but
I would mention is Shakespeare's, whoever Shakespeare was, had a very, very deep understanding of the nature of usury and the precise way in which usury could be employed under the law. And
yeah.
I
Well, let me
can
tell you
send you
something.
some of the texts that he must have known of that were very obscure and
Yeah,
probably never translated into English.
right, exactly. Well, let me just give you a little bonbon so you can just see as an example of how much fun Shakespeare is when you actually kind of understand it. Like in Macbeth, you have the beginning of the play. They go, "Oh, noble Macbeth, he seamed and unseamed his opponent." Right. In other words, the idea that he's using his sword as a needle, and they go, "Noble Macbeth, well does he deserve his name?" You know, this is the passage from the beginning of Macbeth. And then throughout Macbeth, you've got all of this imagery of seamster. They don't understand why are this all of these words relating to, like, fixing, mending clothes, fixing, so that there was a whole Shakespearean puzzle. But if you look at the statement, "Noble Macbeth, well does he deserve his name," and Hebrew, you know that Macbeth means seamster.
Oh, really?
See, yeah. So, I mean, so it's hardly even a pun. It's like it's ludicrous, but they
Have you found a
they wrote
biblical parallel to the sexual relationship of the mother and the son and the in Macbeth? There's some kind of sexual
well.
tension
The thing
going on.
about yeah, yeah, um, it's funny. I have the Macbeth analysis. I'm not even sure. I don't think I put it in the book. I'd have to send it to you separately. But it's a send up of the Gospels. You have this missing period of time, where Duncan is killed. The son of the king, they're just mocking the period of time to crucify. Um, and then Lady Macbeth, she's sitting there, she's washing her hands. I can't get the spot off. I can't get the spot off. I mean, they're goofing off of Pilate, washing the blood of the innocent, right? You see, he washes the blood off. Well, here in this play, she can't get the blood off. See, it's a Jewish reversal and mockering of the gospel. See, the spot, darn this spot, it won't go away. The blood won't go away. Well, if you understand that they've crucified him, you can see that, well, they're just mocking Pontius Pilate washing his hands. He couldn't really do that. But that's the whole thing. The entire Shakespearean literature, all of it, tip to stern, is all built around this. Now some of it involves analysis that I haven't even brought out, because you get into like Timon of Athens. Now you're into a level of typology that's connecting Trajan and Pliny the Younger, and it's sort of like like Caesar's Messiah. Is if you did that kind of decoding of those letters, then you'd be able to understand Timon of Athens. I don't put any of this in Shakespeare because, brother, I've got enough on my plate. You see what I mean? It's like,
and if you make one mistake, they'll seize on it and repeat it over and over.
I was listening to your analysis. I was going, God, Christopher is in exactly the same boat I am, or similar, because there is a kind of building block where the analysis that you've done to lead up to some of the following analysis is needed in order to understand where you're taking, where you're actually taking the understanding. You've got to have decoded these first stuff. Well, when you get into super complicated stuff that's way out, that you need all this understanding, it's just too much for, an everyday reader who's never even read Caesar's Messiah. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You're just going to lose them. So I just take, with Shakespeare, I did the same thing I did with Caesar's Messiah. I just took the very simplest stuff, the easiest thing for people to understand. And if you read it, you'll probably be very disappointed. You'll go, God, it's all makes sense, but why doesn't he go further? There's all this other interesting stuff. And Christopher, I kind of see the interesting stuff. I see the depth. I do. And I have opinions about it. And I think I have concrete analysis, which is why I kind of want to read your stuff about the depth in the Gospels. But I don't bring this out to the public in the first book, presenting a theory of a understood body of literature that everyone has in their mind, and you're completely revolutionizing it. All I can think of, and maybe it's a flaw on my part, but all I can think of is just to bring out the simplest possible stuff. Mm-hmm. And then hope that scholars like you will come along and fill the depth in after the fact. That's what I've done.
Makes good sense. And I will read your book, and I look forward to reading your book. One of the insightful things that struck me while reading Caesar's Messiah was you just described the two lineages given in, Matthew and Luke for Jesus. And you say that both of them are fictions if both of them relate to his father Joseph, because his father Joseph wasn't his father. And some scholars will try to claim, I guess, that Luke is supposedly through his Mother Mary, which supposedly then justifies the discrepancy. But my question to you is, do you believe that Jesus is being portrayed as being descended from Moses and being a Levite instead of a Judahite, and being a priest instead of the tribe of Judah? And one of the reasons I ask that is because Judas Maccabeus was a priest, and therefore of the Levitical tribe and not of the tribe of Judah.
Sure. I totally understand the question. I have no answer.
Do you know if anyone has ever done any research to try to give the lineage of Moses? I don't know if there's enough information in the Old Testament to do that.
They have in this. I would like to just take your thought on Judas Maccabeus and see if we can try to parse that into the Gospels. That there might be.
Well, there's something you may be aware of.
Yeah.
In Hippolytus. Hippolytus, I guess is the correct pronunciation. He talks about the heresies and about the Gnostics, and Judas's gut bursting open in
Yeah,
the field of blood
right.
represents the release of the serpent from his body. The intestines were viewed as being the serpent within the human being. And there were two serpents. There was an evil serpent and there was a holy serpent. And the class of Judas would represent that evil serpent being freed out of his guts. And then you found a parallel story, which I found very interesting, in the Wars of the Jews. And that person who became ill and fretted seeing the ghosts of those whom he had brought to death, and then his guts burst open precisely like Judas.
Yeah.
But I think the name Judas relates to the tribe of Judah, and Judas is a figure who represents the tribe of Judah, and that's very significant in terms of Judas Maccabeus, despite the fact that he was a Levite. He was the one who wanted to preserve the reign of Judea and fought, and he very much acted as a Messiah, son of David. There is a later Gnostic book called the Gospel of Judas, and that states that Judas was actually the only truly righteous disciple. And it states that all the other disciples were simply deceivers of the Gentiles who were leading them into ultimate destruction, because Jesus is this Messiah, son of Joseph, who will ultimately come back. The Kabbalists point out that the Christ returns as the Antichrist at the end of the times of the Gentiles, and then punishes them for the anti-Semitism that they have been inspired to practice against the Jews, which serves that satanic role of enforcing divine justice, and also serves to prevent the assimilation of Jews with Gentiles during the times of the Gentiles. So it served that useful function for both of them. So Judas is perceived in the Gospel of Judas as the good and only beloved disciple of Jesus, because he forces Jesus to die and to fulfill his role and to fulfill the Father's will. So that's my take on Judas. And I, again, was very struck by that intestines bursting open, because in one of my books I go into that, how the Gnostics said that that represented the release of the serpent.
Yeah. I can't wait to read your book. I'd love to see that analysis. I was, and when I'm talking about, I'm relating it to Josephus's history and into the Gospels, and it's on just that surface level. I try to avoid the depth that your analysis implies, but it seems perfectly logical. I have just to throw out something you might find interesting. I think that Judas Maccabee and the people who came into Judea to get rid of the Seleucids, that they were actually the descendants of Hannibal. I think that
Carthaginians?
Hannibal, the Carthaginians. I think Hannibal had a proto-Judaism, and I think he had the Moses stories. And I think he comes into Italy. He's there for, how many years? 20 years, something like that. He's just running around. They're fighting battle after battle. They finally drive him out. They don't know where he died. They don't know anything really about the ending of the army, but he's heading towards Syria. And then 20 years later, or thereabouts, you have the Hasmoneans. And I just find this too much parallelism and overlap to think that these groups weren't somehow related. The question
Wasn't there
is,
a connection between the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians and
that's
the
right.
worship of Moloch?
There were Semitic people, and you see, because the Romans sponged the literature, we don't know. That's why my conjecture is, at least plausible, because there's no way to negate it. But Josephus talks about the Carthaginians, and he has this very strange, cryptic kind of relationship between Solomon and the Carthaginians. And I think that he's actually inferring that the Romans knew that Solomon and the Carthaginians had a kind of shared religion, which then is what the Carthaginian survivors, who then had another generation, brought back in a fundamental way into Judea, because they would then see, I mean, it kind of works all historically too, because the descendants of Hannibal would have seen, basically Rome destroy their religion. And when they would then view Judea, where, the Moses stories are all linking into, they would see the Gentile kind of gymnasium culture, right, as being just, blasphemous. And so this then becomes the basis for the Hasmonean army, and the rationale for the battle and whatnot. Um, I don't
Religiously,
have
you might
any
want to
I don't
look
have any
in.
I don't have any citations of after the fact, though, which is kind of curious. Why would they not represent this? Perhaps they wanted to keep it hidden. Um, this group then, you know, it becomes way too complicated for me to understand at a certain point, because you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, who are definitely fundamentals, and they are of the belief in the strict Hasmonean understanding of Judaism. But there's nothing in their literature that talks about Carthage or Hannibal or any of that stuff. They just have the straight understanding of the history of Jews that is given in the Old Testament. That's what they're linking to. So I don't have a good kind of marker to indicate that my theory has, more than just logical plausibility. But at
May
least,
I make a
sure.
suggestion? In terms of Acts, it talks about the star of Remphan and the worship of Moloch, and that would relate directly to the Carthaginians and Phoenicians, because they found statues of Moloch, the furnaces, in which they would offer the firstborn. And the generation of that period was
Where did they
claimed to
find
be
them?
highly wicked and may have been conducting Moloch sacrifices within
Did
the
they find
temple.
them in Carthaginian areas?
Yes,
See, this I didn't know that, and that's an incredibly important insight. Thanks for sharing it.
oh, you're very welcome. It's very interesting. That would be what would have brought that back to that area after Hezekiah and Josiah had gone around destroying things like that within the kingdom. It could have been Carthaginians who were
If you
among
don't
those who
mind,
reintroduced Moloch worship.
this is kind of one of my pet theories, and I don't have enough historical background to flesh it out. If you wouldn't mind sending me, just your thoughts on it, I would really appreciate it, because it
Certainly,
might help.
certainly, it's very interesting.
And if you want, we can write it up as a joint paper. I don't want to. I know I'd be stealing some of your really good insights, so I would just
No, no,
I
no,
would
no, not at all.
create a draft, and then if you want, you can send it out as a
It
because
never would have occurred to me without having
really
this
do.
conversation, which is so wonderful.
I think it's a really good kind of way of explaining where the Hasmoneans come from, which to date has not really been well, documented or even understood.
Is there
But
much known
anyway,
about how the Romans got involved in that civil war that eventually
with,
led to the destruction of the Hasmoneans and the rise of Herod's? And
there's a lot of literature. There's a lot of literature on that, but it's mainly Josephus, where he's the one that kind of creates the narrative about the struggle that takes place. I don't, but here's one of the problems, Christopher. I just don't believe a single word of Josephus. Honestly, I don't see him as a historian. He's a propagandist, and it's self-serving for the Roman imperial court. So you're looking through this lens. So that's how I mean. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of history in it, no doubt. But you do have that one problem, is that he's not an honest person. He's a propagandist.
I think he's been perceived that way by many
Yeah,
people down
yeah,
through history,
sure.
and the only thing that preserved him was the testimonium, which may have been introduced by Eusebius.
Yeah, you want to see my take on the testimonium? I have it in Caesar's. I think it's in Caesar. Yeah, I think it's in
Yes,
Caesar.
absolutely.
I
You
wrote
have
it
a
right now.
long section
But
on it.
my take on it is, but it's my take is completely different than New Testament scholarship. 180. Well, not. I mean, it's just so unusual, my understanding of it. But that's how I see it. I see it as as a linked literature with the two stories around it, and it tells a little story, a history of the origin of Christianity. Um, I mean, people talk about the testimonium being falsified or, being redacted. The people who go into these areas where they try to tease out from the text an original text, I just see this as, it's not a very precise literary analysis approach. I mean, sometimes all you can do, but you obviously see the problem is that you have to like tease out what the original material was, and it's easy to make mistakes in that process. So I have it, and as I understand it, a better approach, at least in terms of parsimony, because I just say, now we can take the whole thing. It comes from the same group that produces the Josephus histories, but we just haven't understood it yet because we haven't really bothered to understand the relationship from the testimony and to the two stories that are right next to it. Yeah.
Well, that's what strikes me as strange is why would it only be such a brief paragraph when discussing something of such tremendous import, and why wasn't it mentioned by so many others, and why wasn't it mentioned in the Wars of the Jews? Good
points. Really good points. Sure. And then nothing about the zany and insane stories that surround it. You have this narrative where you're talking about the military campaign of Pontius Pilate, and then all of a sudden you have 3 stories pop up, which are just obviously, well, I mean, the testimonium is what it is, but the 2 stories on either side of the testimonium are just weird and zany, and they don't make any sense, and like they're.
That's why I suspect there's some hidden oral tradition behind what it was.
Well, there could be, or it could just be the tradition, and the oral tradition was just the kind of sense of mockery that the Flavians wanted to engage in. I think that one of the problems with the Gospels and the New Testament and letters of Paul is there are different iterations of authors. It wasn't just a single pulse to create the New Testament. You had the synoptics are clearly related, but then you have John. This is probably a different group. They're aware of the meaning of the synoptics, but they have their own things that they want to achieve, both legacy and humor and theology. And then you have Paul, and then you go on to the book of Revelation. I give my take on the book of Revelation in the Shakespearean book, and I need to do that there, and I need to bring out my take on Paul, because then this is applied into the Shakespearean literature, so it makes the Shakespearean literature a little more coherent. So but I really didn't want to get into like Revelation and Paul until Caesar's Messiah was well established, because it's more complicated. And I just wanted to use a very simple building block approach. And I know it's easy to criticize me for that. And I'm sure for someone who goes into the depth like you do, you can say, well, there's so much more here. Well, yeah, there is. But what I'm trying to do is just reach, every ordinary, everyday person, and to show him that, look, the Gospels are not history. We have a problem here. We have a real problem because we're not dealing with an honest, sincere literature. This is something
they're not benefiting humanity.
And it's not benefiting humanity. So anyway,
it's not moral, and it is not divine.
No. Yeah, and so that was, anyway, so that's kind of how Caesar's Messiah ended up being what it is. But so there it is. We should try to talk again. I hope we can. I would like to talk after I've had a chance to read your book. I think I can be a little, as I said, I'd like to be more supportive of, trying to get you and others who take a more imaginative approach, approach of more depth, and one that is, grounded in some skepticism, as opposed to most New Testament scholarship. So,
thank you so much. That's tremendously generous of you.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to do it. It's.
I don't want to. You've been so generous with your time. I don't want to abuse that gift, and I very much would like to speak.
I'd like to talk all day. The problem is at my age, I just become brain dead. Just fade away, so it's hard.
I hear you. I know exactly what you mean.
So
And I think there is a chemistry of the brain, and there are limitations, and the brain has to rebuild up those chemicals which are being utilized to form an
I had to do
idea.
a real long, like, kind of analysis verbal exchange this morning, and so now when I get done, I'm going to go take a nap, and then I'll come back to life. But
I'm
so
so
anyway,
tremendously grateful to you. It was
thank
wonderful
you.
to have
It was
met
a
you.
great pleasure, and I honestly, we have to do it again. It was really interesting for me to listen to you, and I will read the book, and then we'll have even better exchanges.
Thank you, sir, so very much. Take care.
Thank you, Christopher. Appreciate it. All right.
Bye-bye.
See you, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you.